So it's 7:02. I think I'll go ahead and get started with this. Welcome, everybody. It's great to see you all. I'm Susan Verdicchio, Chair of the Winchester Select Board, and this is a public information and input session for the development at the corner of Washington and Swanton Streets. I'm here with Acting Town Manager Beth Rudolph and Town Planner Brian Zacchelli, and joined by a couple of joined by our, not to forget, our consultant on this whole process, Jen Goldson, joined by my colleague Mike Betancourt and my colleague Rich Mucci. So I just want to check, Beth, this is not posted as a meeting, or is it, as a select board meeting? Anyway,
Patty, you could better speak to that.
just trying to check to see if I have to do any more parliamentary procedure.
Well, it was posted as the select board is hosting this
Okay.
as a public information session.
All right.
I mean, that's
So just out of an abundance of caution, I'll call the select board meeting to order since there is a quorum here, there are three of us. And it's a public information session on January 12th, 2022. Just gonna pull up my notes here. So I just want to let you know that Town Planner Brian Zacchelli and our consultant, Jen Goldson, will shortly be making a presentation on the whole bidding process that the town is required to follow for this under state law. And then we'll open up a comment and question period. But first, I'd like to just give a brief overview, which I'm going to read to be sure I don't leave anything out. As most of you know, this property at Washington and Swanton was for many decades a thriving small neighborhood shopping area. And then as that started to fall on some hard times, there was a failed proposal to redevelop it as a CVS. And when that failed and the buildings were sort of just standing vacant and deteriorating, the select board in 2020 came to town meeting for authorization to acquire the property for up to $3.2 million via a negotiated purchase or a taking by eminent domain for the purpose of affordable housing, which we know the town needs. And town meeting voted approval. The select board had voted a housing production plan in 2018 after two very large 40B projects were proposed, both for about 300 units. And one of those was to be located at Forest Ridge, a wooded area off of Forest Street, and the other was proposed for Holton Street. So after the town meeting proposal was after the town meeting vote, while special town council began to negotiate with the owner, town staff put together a small working group to begin writing a request for proposals, or RFP, which is the first document needed to find a qualified developer and get the project underway. The group included a select board member, town staff, and some members of the neighborhood. Unfortunately, the negotiations failed, and after further research and investigation by the town's appraiser, the select board returned to town meeting in November, this last November, to ask for a higher amount up to $5.3 million. And that was based on a revised appraisal of the property's fair market value at its highest and best use. There was an amendment added during town meeting that requires all of the units, all of the residential units, to be listed on the town's subsidized housing inventory, which effectively means the project must be all rental units. Town meeting again approved, and the town did record an order of taking later in November, paying $5.27 million. The working group was reconvened then to revise the existing draft RFP. So what you're seeing tonight and what was sent out to other boards and committees for review is a revised draft, and other town boards and committees have provided some comments and suggestions. We heard them on Monday night. And tonight's session is an opportunity for community members to ask questions and provide comments as well. So at this point, I'll turn things over to Ms. Goldson and Town Planner Zacchelli.
All right, sounds good. I think I'll go ahead and share the screen now. Unless, Brian, did you want to say a few words before I did that?
No, actually, I'm actually not this is actually your presentation, Jen. And that I was going to facilitate the public input.
That
So
sounds
that'll-
great to me.
Yep.
And so I just want to make sure that you can see the screen properly, the actual screen presentation section of the screen. Does it look good? Okay. I was on a webinar the other day and they shared their presenter view and it was all their notes were there and everything. So now I'm nervous. I'm like, am I sharing the right screen? But I'm glad that I am. Okay, good. So let's get started and we're going to do a relatively quick presentation here because I know that you're all here not so much to hear this presentation, but more so to give your comments. But I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page about what's in the RFP and what the purpose of it is. And we also have some example of how the criteria scoring could be used just from another project that I worked on that was successful in selecting a developer. So that's what we'll talk about today. And so let's go through the municipal disposition process just at a very high level. So the town is bound by a municipal land disposition procedures under Chapter 30B, Section 16, that deals with disposition of real estate. And the purpose of 30B really in all of its sections, but including in the land disposition procedures, is to provide a process so that the town can have an open and fair competition so that proposers are really on a common footing and they know exactly how you're going to be making a selection and a decision, what the process is, what criteria will you be using to judge against, and they can then decide, do I, number one, want to make a proposal at all, and number two, when I do make my proposal, what do I include in it? And really 30B and the way that we're going to lay out the RFP is giving the town the ability to make really meaningful comparisons. So you're really comparing apples to apples on all of the proposals. So that's sort of the overview and intention of 30B. And then the specific steps when you're doing a land disposition process of town-owned land is you create a RFP, which we'll go through the draft in some detail today. Then you issue that, open proposals in public. They must be opened in public for this kind of an RFP. And then you review and evaluate them based on the criteria that you stated. You select a preferred developer following what's called the Rule for Award, which needs to be clearly stated. Basically, how are you going to make that decision and what's your rule? And then town meeting must approve the disposition of the land and authorize the select board to execute a land disposition agreement. You also must submit state disclosures prior to entering into an agreement. And then once the developer fulfills the terms of that agreement, then you can close on the sale of the property. And I'm happy to go back to these slides if any questions are pertinent to these. But let me just keep going for now. So the RFP structure, some of you may have read it. I believe it was distributed already fairly broadly. And the structure gives really an overview of characteristics of this property, including important dates, redevelopment objectives, which we'll go over on the next slide. And then we include other site details and maps, including development constraints. The request for proposal section is what is our selection process? What's our rule for the award? When are we going to allow questions? How do you submit questions? And we'll have a pre-submission meeting. And then what is the deadline for submission and how do you submit? What is the format? And then submission criteria is really how we get into what are you submitting? What is the required content? We require them to submit a narrative, and we detail, lots of things that they need to include in that narrative, as well as conceptual designs, how you're going to be doing marketing, zoning, required forms, and then the selection criteria is laid out, and we'll go over that in some detail as well. But the point of being so detailed in the submission requirement is really so you can figure out if the submission is complete, and if not, you can basically send it back saying this is not complete, or you can reject it. Okay. So the redevelopment objectives, this is based on town meetings vote. And so it includes mixed income housing, where all units will be included on the subsidized housing inventory. And as Selectwoman Verdicchio had mentioned, that is likely to mean an all rental project. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. We also have encouragement of deeply affordable units, including for extremely low and very low income households, which goes, which just so in case you're not familiar with some of these terms, that's essentially more deeply affordable than the minimum required to get on the subsidized housing inventory or to be included. And so those two things are really important to think about how you're going to judge and what the criteria is. So we'll get into that more in detail, but I just wanted to highlight that. Then there's the financial consideration, recover or exceed the full purchase price of the $5.27 million. There's a retail and public amenities objective, where the neighborhood in particular indicated a strong preference for the Washington Street frontage to include some retail component. And then also encouraging other public amenities, such as a pocket park, is something that we mention. Then there's also design considerations. And in fact, the town had a local architect, or maybe he's not local, but I know he's worked with Winchester a lot before, create design guidelines that were vetted by the planning board, and that would be integrated as an appendix that the developer would need to meet and comply with those design guidelines. And then there's environmental sustainability objectives as well, including minimize, if not eliminate, the use of fossil fuels, and incorporate other non-energy features to achieve resilience. So those are some of the main objectives, and we're going to get into a little more details on some of these. So let me start with this mixed income housing. There's a few things I want to highlight here. So in order to include 100% of the units on the subsidized housing inventory, there are two general scenarios. In theory, you could have an all ownership project, but all of those units, so let's say it's a condo project, all of those units would need to be restricted, deed restricted, to be at or below 80% of the area median income. And the reason Select Board Member Verdicchio had mentioned that it's probably going to be an all rental is because it's unclear if that's actually a feasible project to put forward, a 100% ownership that would all count on the subsidized housing inventory as affordable. But I put it up there because in theory you could do that. The second scenario is all rental. And within rental, there are two ways you can get all the units to count on the subsidized housing inventory. One is to have 25% of the units restricted as affordable to 80% of the area median income. And I'm going to show you what that is in just a moment. That's considered low income. And then the other scenario would be having 20% of the units restricted, but at a more deeply affordable level at that 50% of the area median income. And so this next chart just shows you what that means. So the way that these different levels are calculated, these income levels are calculated, is based on household size. And so you can see the numbers at the top here are based on are showing household size. So for example, a single person household, someone living alone, if they made an income of $70,750 a year, it's gross income, then they would be considered low income at that 80% limit. And then you can see the differences if you have a 2-person household, 3-person, 4-person, etc. And so that's what you would need. These are the income thresholds here on this bottom line when I talk about 80% of the area median income. When I talk about 50% of the area median income, it's a lower income. And so a single person household would make no more than $47,000 a year. And then it goes up from there, 4-person household, $67,100. So I just want to give you a sense of, what is that difference? What does that mean? And if there are, I don't know if we have the Q&A open. I think we do. So if there are questions that come in that are specific to clarifying any of these points, maybe Brian or someone could just let me know and I'd be happy to explain more. Okay. So the next thing I want to point out is that when you do some, rough calculations on, well, what could households at those different levels afford? You can see these green boxes here. So if you're looking at an ownership situation, let's say it's for a condo, and you're a single person living alone, and you make that, on the last slide, you saw that it was $70,750 a year. If you're at that 80% of the area median income, that means you could afford roughly, and there's lots of assumptions that go into this. I'm happy to talk more about what our assumptions were, but essentially you could afford a condo of about $221,000. And then if you're a two-person household, you could afford a condo of about 258, so just under 260,000. And if you look at the median condo prices in Winchester for the last current year we have available, which is 2021, the median sales price, according to the Warren Group, is 650,000. So you can see there's a big gap there. And that's one reason we're saying that an all ownership project may not be, is likely not to be economic because of that huge gap in what the construction costs would actually be per unit. Okay, but now let's look over at the rental section. So I have two boxes here. One is for that 50% area median income, and the other is for 80% area median income. And we did the same household sizes, 1 and 2 person households. And so if you're a household at 80% of the area median income, you could afford roughly, if you're a person living alone, you could afford about $1,769. So let's just call that just under $1,800. And then if you're a two-person household, you could afford just over $2,000. But the interesting thing here is that when you look at the median listed rent in Winchester, which is, I pulled 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, and 3 bedroom, you can see that it's actually pretty close to what a 1 and 2 person household can afford. So there's not a big difference between market rate rental and 80% AMI rental in terms of cost. And so when you talk to housing practitioners and housing advocates, one of the reasons when we run numbers like this that we say the need for more deeply affordable rental units is greater than the need for that 80% unit is because the market rate rents are pretty close to what an 80% AMI person could afford or household could afford. Now that's not saying you have enough market rate rent. You don't. So there's that consideration as well. But I just wanted to show you those numbers. And then if you look at what a household at the 50% range could afford, it's much less than what the market rate is providing. So hopefully that gives a little clarity about why you hear some people maybe push for more deeply affordable units. Okay, and I'm happy to stop again, Brian, if there are questions. I'm not looking at them right now. Okay, so let's get into the RFP itself. So there's development submission requirements, and you can see that they're very thorough. We want to have details on the units, the affordability levels, the accessibility levels, the physical plan. We want concept drawings. We want a description of environmental sustainability, climate change mitigation features, and all these things. I won't read them all. You can see them there for yourself. But I'll just point out it does include project financing, pro forma, pre-development budget. So it gets into a good amount of detail. And then for the evaluation criteria, and this is what I want to spend some time going over, and we have a few slides on this. So there's 2 steps. One is just the minimum threshold, which is you're either in or you're out. You either meet it or you don't. So we have, is your submission complete? If not, if it's, small things, the town has the ability to go back to the developer and say, you missed this form or you missed this one or 2 things. You have the ability to do that, but you're not mandated to. You could throw out an application that's not complete. Second one is minimum 5 years affordable housing experience. Then we did add here the 100% of units must be eligible for inclusion on the subsidized housing inventory, or SHI, sometimes you'll hear people say. You need to have a successful track record of 3 or more projects of similar scope and scale, so similar building type, similar density, etc. And then financial capacity. We want to see you have at least 2 times the pre-development budget. Okay, then that's just to get in the door. And then once you meet that, for the projects that do meet that minimum, we'll then go over to the comparative criteria. And I'll show you all of these in a moment, but these are the different categories, and this is where the scoring comes in. So we have different categories of affordability, design and scale, site design or layout, sustainability, etc. And you can see all these categories here. And each one is weighted different, and each one has different details as to what are we looking for each of these. So here's the comparative criteria, and we have 2 levels of scoring. First of all, there's 3 categories for each of these comparative criteria. So we have highly advantageous, advantageous, or not advantageous. And then the second level is we have weighting. We weighted these priorities. Some things are more important than others. And I think this list is actually in order of priority, but I'm going to be more specific about that in just a moment. So now I'm going to go through the next, let's see, 3 slides are really specifics of the draft RFP that was circulated and what it said each of these criteria, and then the weighting and how it would be ranked. And so the most important priorities here are weighted as times 4. So that means that if under the first one, purchase price, somebody proposes to offer 5.27, which is recovering the full purchase price, you get 2 points for that as highly advantageous, and then you multiply it by 4. And so, so you get 8 points. So in this way, you basically get a score for each criteria, and it's just pretty simple math here, but I'm going to also show you an example of this. And then the next one is about the affordability and how deeply are they proposing these units, and are there a mix of incomes. And so this is something that was really written prior to town meetings vote to make all of the make sure all of the units count on the subsidized housing inventory. And so we'd love to get some more feedback on this particular one to see how you'd like to write up these 3 categories of highly advantageous, advantageous, and not. But the way it's written up now is that you don't get any extra points. You make it in, but you don't get any extra if you're just meeting the minimum, 25% of units at 80% AMI. And then here you're getting a little bit more points, another point essentially, well, 1 times 4 because it's weighted as 4. If you go above that, and you're providing units as low as 30% at or below 30% AMI affordability for the households at that income level. And then we have the next category of you're providing even more, and that you have income restricted units that exceed 50% of the total. And we see a range from this at and below 30% AMI up to 120%. So those are that's the way we wrote it now, and we'd love to get some more feedback on that. I'm happy to go back to this slide when we get more into the discussion. Okay, so weight number 3, this is the second tier of priority. And I'm not going to read every single one of these, but you can just see we have developer exhibits willingness to work with the community and town officials. Development concept, narrative, and drawings demonstrate thoughtful consideration. Site layout considers streetscape and provides outdoor space for residents. Developer identifies traffic mitigation measures, including bike and pedestrian improvements, and then the project incorporates that retail component or provides other essential public amenities. And you can see that there's a difference between how we rank it in this scheme based on what the priorities are. Okay, again, I'm happy to go back to these. The next one is weights 2 and weights 1. So proposer provides sufficient parking. Design meets climate change and sustainability objectives. Those are both a weight of 2. And then proposal includes initial pre-development timeline, specifies zoning, etc. Development team includes details on other properties that they're managing, and then specifies how noise, traffic, construction, etc. will be managed. So that gives you a sense of how this draft was written. And I just wanted to go through just an example, because we did have some questions about how do you put this into practice. So for another one,
sorry, Jen,
yeah.
sorry, super quick.
Yeah.
Just to address, there's one comment and one question. I think it might be a good time to just take a quick, because there's
Sure.
only 2 in there. The comment here is one that It's an anonymous attendee, but they're concerned about the economic viability of the property if there's too many subsidized units. So the town could make up these amounts, but not for how much that we really need to make the affordable units. Please consider a higher score for really hitting that mark of, it says, please consider higher scores for projects that meet the 25%, so that the ratio of the subsidized units to the market units are larger. And then the question that we'll take right now, it says, is there was a reference to construction costs, and is that really the comparison of condo market versus subsidized in terms of building the for building the units? And I think there's more to that, Jen, but if you wanted to answer that real quick before we get into this Oak Bluffs example.
I guess I'm not actually sure of what the question means. Are they saying, how are we going to compare condos to rental if we get a mix?
I think it was something that you would reference in the presentation, that the difference in cost of constructing the condo market rate units
Oh,
versus
I see.
subsidized. Yeah, if there was, so what was
Yeah.
that really comparing?
Yeah.
And that's
So
the only question that we have.
Just
Yep.
generally, especially now that everything's going up in terms of construction materials and costs, you can't really build units for what you'd have to sell them for to be affordable at this level. And so there's more subsidies that are involved with making the project economic. You can't build a unit for $221,000 per unit, and you can't, build it for $258,000. So you wouldn't make your money. You wouldn't even make your money back on a project that's 100% ownership, which is why we're saying it's very likely to be uneconomic to build an all ownership project with all of the units restricted to 80%. Am I getting the question? Did I clarify that a little bit more?
I believe so, but there could be a follow-up later on. But why don't
Okay,
we?
sure. I'm happy to go
then-
back to it.
Yep. And I'm going to try to answer as many I can in the chat, and
Okay,
we'll
perfect.
continue. We'll continue on.
Great, thank you. Okay, so here's just the example, and it's really just kind of simple math here, but in this community, there were 11 categories of criteria. Each one was the same as the one, that we wrote for you all: highly advantageous, advantageous, not advantageous. And then there were weights assigned, and you can see the weights here. In this particular example, they didn't go up to the 4x just because they felt they only had, 3 categories of importance. And affordability and commitment to sustainability, and then the sensitivity to landscape and design was actually their top priorities at 3 times, with a weight of 3 times. And so I'm just going to break this down for you. So this is an example that shows what they did with that. So the evaluation committee went through a whole evaluation process, and they did the math, and they essentially came up with a score for each criteria, and then wrote up a memo to the select board saying, this is why we're recommending, in this case, this AIIHT project, because I'll show you the aggregated matrix to show all the scores across the categories, but they came out the highest in the aggregated score. And the way they did it was they had 10 points. In each, it got a little, some of the criteria get a little complicated, because to be highly advantageous, there may be 3 things you have to meet. And in that case, what they decided to do, instead of have a simple score of 3 points for highly advantageous, they just gave 10 points. It doesn't matter, you can just go down into fractions if you need to, but just so you know why this is saying 10 points for meeting all 3 components of highly advantageous. They just wanted to make the math a little, less about fractions and more about kind of these whole numbers. So then they just applied the weight of 3, and that's how they got the 30, because they felt this particular project met all 3 of those highly advantageous components, and then multiplied it by the factor of 3. And then this other group, they took some points away because they didn't feel they met completely highly advantageous. And then this is just, so I just gave you one example of the detail, but this is just the aggregated matrix that show for all of the different criteria here. They have the importance, the weights in this top one. They have the 2 different proposals that they got, and then they went through and just highlighted in green the ones that kind of were higher than the other, or if they were tied, they were in blue. and then they just combine the score. And I just put down here so you could see like how if each one got a maximum score, they would get, 30 for all of these most important, and then 20 for the others, and 10 for the ones with a factor of 1. And so the highest score would have been 220. Nobody got that, but the IHT project got 188. So that's just how it was done. It's relatively straightforward. Maybe it sounds a little complicated when I'm explaining it, but it's just pretty much straightforward math. All right. So then the only other piece of the RFP is just the appendices, and I just put this here, but there's a bunch of different, there's the design standards, some background information, diagram of existing site conditions, the legal notice, and then a handful of required forms. So I think that's everything. And again, I'm happy to also take this down if it's in the way and you'd rather not see it, but I'm also happy to go back to anything. Brian, do you think I should leave it up or?
Yeah, why don't you take it down for now? So there are a lot of people that are commenting on the chat, but I think now, if we could, there are a lot of people on the call, and I think I need to gauge to see how many people would like to speak this evening. So if everyone who know that they want to speak, for sure, if you could please raise your hand now, just so we could figure out some timing. It's 7:30, and we're just trying to figure this out in terms of how many people. So I'm only really seeing, okay, so not a lot of hands here. So I think we're going to be opening up the entire, so not just about questions for Jen Goldson, about the presentation right now, but it's kind of really everything that's related to the RFP that could be directed to a select board member or anybody else here as a panelist. So I'm not seeing many hands. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to limit people to 5 minutes. And we'll go from there. I see 5 people with their hand raised, and I will start with Lisa Atenazio. If we could potentially elevate Lisa, and you can go right ahead with your question, and I'll do my best to direct to the right person.
Okay, can you guys hear me now?
Yes, please go right ahead.
All right, thank you so much for having this. I have been, looking for housing for many years. I have many experiences with the whole process, the landlords, the Section 8, the public, the housing authorities, the contracts, the developers. You name it, I've been through it. And if you've never heard of anything happening before, it's because you haven't met me. Seriously, though, I do have a lot of questions with regards to this, and I am glad again that you are doing subsidized rentals. My question would be with regards to the amounts of, and I do have a few, and I don't want to take up too much of your time, but with regards to the rents, for example, sometimes when you get a developer who's going to go in there and build the apartments and everything else, and say the one person has to pay $11.75. Well, all of a sudden, on top of the, like Moderna in Medford, on top of the $11.75, now they want you to pay $75 a month for a parking spot. If you want an extra parking spot, that's another $150. And they want you to add into the water, into the sewer. And if you need a bigger mailbox, or if you need storage, which is probably only like a 2x4, which is very small, everything just goes and adds up and adds up. And it really starts to, make things unaffordable, so to speak. And I'm all for paying my fair share of the rent, don't get me wrong. But when, say, if when you're up at the $11.75 and all of a sudden you're adding in all this extra things. Now you're up to 1,800. And, you know, it's just, I want you guys to be aware of that. And I don't know exactly who controls that, if that's the city that controls that, if that's the contractor. And you got to be very, very careful with what goes into those agreements, because there's a lot of things that, you know, people will slide in, they'll get slick. I can't explain it, but if I had more time and I didn't, you know what I'm trying to, they'll sneak these little clauses in, and I could tell you stories that would just, it would just make you shake your head.
Thank you, Lisa. So I think, Jen, if you want to talk a little bit about the DHCD guidelines that are part of all of these types of these mixed income developments, and also the other regulatory agreements that the town has with DHCD. If you could talk a little bit about that.
I mean, I don't know the Moderna project and what, you know, what happened there, the one that you referenced. But the state does, you know, under 40B, and the subsidizing agency that would be essentially providing the funds and the subsidies would have restrictions about what you can essentially charge, you know, affordable rents, and things like caps on what you can add on. So I don't want to speak out of my depth, because I don't know, Lisa, what you were referring to with this. I think you said a Moderna project that was adding all sorts of things on. But as far as I know, property owners are restricted from those types of add-ons. But I think that also, with the town being the owner of the property, you could also look carefully at, you know, at the developer's operating budget and plan for rents and any add-ons and things like that, which is a benefit of the fact that this is now town-owned property, rather than just a 40B on the private market. So I don't know, Brian, if you wanted to add to anything.
No, I think you you did, Lisa. If you wanted, you have a minute for a follow-up. If you had a follow-up.
Can you still hear me?
Yep,
Yeah.
go right ahead.
Yeah, I didn't, the projects that I'm referring to are over in Medford. And again, the one thing I don't have experience with is when the town owns it. I don't know if that's the same as what Medford owning that one, but again, is there a difference if the town is going to own it? And where you say that there's caps on certain things. In other words, I'm not just talking about the rent, I am talking about the add-ons and
Yep.
how high can it actually go?
Right. Yeah, I understand. Yeah, the town owns it now, is what I was saying. I don't know these Medford projects and what the details are on those. But if it's a 40B project, which is the way that this one would be approved, you know, you shouldn't have those issues, but I think, you know, we could certainly keep that in mind. Mike?
Thanks, Jen. It's a really good question. Thank you, Lisa. I think in these regulatory agreements, a lot of these fees are prorated for the affordable units. So they may be normally pretty high and expensive, but they are typically prorated. That doesn't mean they're still affordable for people. So I think it's helpful for us at this stage to have visibility to what the regulatory agreements allow, and if there is a way for us to add deeper subsidies there. So to your question, you know, residents in the building that have affordable units aren't nickeled and dimed on certain things that that really chip away at the affordability. So it's a really helpful comment. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, so I just have in order of the way people, in order of when they raised their hand, and it is, just so everyone is aware at the moment, it's Diabjarius, then John Miller, Tom Voltero, Stephen Boksansky, Roger Wilson, and Sarah Swartz. So we're gonna go right to Diabjarius. Diabjarius, you have a max of 5 minutes. Oh, right, I'm sorry, he has to get elevated as a panelist. We'll wait just a few seconds there, getting ahead of myself. Looks like Dieb's still muted.
Good evening.
All right, go right ahead, Dieb. You have 5
I
minutes.
actually,
Yep,
I have been selected by mistake. I apologize. I don't know
wonderful.
how that happened.
Well, that was a wonderful waste of 40 seconds, but we'll be okay.
Okay. Here we are.
John
Thank
Miller,
you.
John Miller, if you could please elevate John Miller to a panelist. John, I do have the PDF you requested. You just let me know when you would like it to be shared. And whenever you start, you will have the floor will be yours for
Well,
5.
yeah, I sent Patricia a slide to get put up for me.
Yep, I have it here if you would like me to put it up right now.
Yeah, and then you can start the clock. Okay, Brian?
Of course.
I'm going to be less than 5 minutes though.
Whatever you want. We'll get it up. So
You know, if can you put it in in view mode so it's bigger? Yeah, great. So I have been in this space for a long time, 40 years. I'm a procurement lawyer and a construction lawyer by trade. I think the RFP needs to be restructured with all respect to you, Ms. Golson. I would use as my barometer some principles of competition put out by the American Bar Association for state and local governments. And they're on the right-hand side of the slide. And I think where the X's are, I think the current draft, and I know it's a draft, and I'm sure it'll be a lot better in the next round. And that's one of the things I wanted to caution. I know this can be fixed quickly and it can be fixed effectively. But my basic concern is that it fails to meet most of the ABA's principles of competition. It's really a cosmetic competition up front without, right now, as the draft reads, without binding commitments from the proposers. And then it's followed by what I would call basically a sole source negotiation between the selected developers and the various boards, and with input from abutters and input from staff, which is fine. All that hard work is necessary, but in order to meet the principles of a sound procurement and get the best value, to get the money back and the safe harbor. I mean, no one's mentioned safe harbor, but if we have 40 units there with 80% of AMI or lower, we have a year of safe harbor, and that was what was talked about ad nauseum at town meeting. So those are the two goals. And I think we need to focus on those two goals, and everything else, the hard work should be done by the committees and the boards and the abutters, so that the design criteria that you mentioned, the design, all that stuff is done up front. And it's the competition that cleanses everything, that allows everybody to say, okay, hey, we did the best we could. I think the reason that it should be restructured is to attract more high quality proposers. You mentioned section 16 and of chapter 30B, but section 16 says nothing about competitive seal proposals. The authority for that comes from section 6. And section 6 allows a two-step process that I've outlined in the bottom of the left slide. We could have a price competition until the last second when a price envelope is opened. That would keep the town with substantial leverage and before you enter the sole source negotiation. And what could happen on the side is a technical submission by proposers. A lot of the criteria that you have can be recast as minimum or threshold criteria. They don't need to be, you don't need to have 12 or 13 of these criteria. It's mush, it's going to get muddled, and it leaves too much room for, whistles and bells or English on the points. And what that is a signal to proposers is, hey, I might do a bang up job. I might spend $500,000 and someone might give me a 2 instead of a 3 on a whim and I lose. So you don't want that. And I think the content proposal can be done in 2 steps, where you get the initial content, you meet with proposers that are in the range of winning, you have discussions with them, you give them a chance to improve their proposals, then they submit their final technical proposal along with their price envelope, you open them up at the same time, the LDA is fixed, is done, and you have a winner and you go do the project. I think you can save a lot of money. You can get more money in, you can save a lot of time in carrying costs. And this is done thousands of times around the world. So, and it's, you know, we have people in this town that are expert in this, not me, okay? So there are other people that can help do this. And I think we should need to restructure this. Finally, I've sent the select board detailed comments on the proposal, Ms. Goldson, with my, detailed suggestions, and I'm going to send those to town meeting members. Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you all.
Yes, of course. I didn't know if we do have Anderson and Krieger, our legal counsel, Mina Makarios here. If there was going to be any response, I believe he would be the correct person to do that. But I don't know if there was a. I think you were voicing your concerns. I don't know if there was a direct question to legal counsel.
No, I didn't. I think. I know Mina. Mina's a great lawyer. I have no problem with Mina. The problem is you're using the process from section 6 to make an award under 16. You can do them in tandem and combine it and get you can get a better result, Mina. It's not, this is, I bet I could put 100 projects in front of you in 2 weeks that have done it differently.
All right, thanks, John, for the comment. Mina, if you want to respond, and
Sure,
then we'll move on. We'll move on to Tom Volterro next.
Yeah, I'll just take 10 seconds because I think the public comments are much more useful than hearing much from me tonight. But the upshot is I don't disagree, John, that you can use some of the processes in section 6 when you're doing an RFP for land under section 16. As you pointed out, this is still a draft. We are working with the town on making that draft better, and there are points that I agree with that. How much you can, when that last stage is that you can preserve open competition for multiple people before selecting a bidder is a little bit of a tougher call because of 30B, but there is a possibility. And I think one of the recommendations you made, for instance, is having a recommended proposed upfront form of agreement, which is actually pretty common in almost all the RFPs we work on with the town, that we've helped draft for the town, and is something we're in the process of drafting at our suggestion with the town manager's office as well. Again, so I
believe section 6 explicitly authorizes this 2-step internal competition and allows you to hold the technical submissions private and even the initial price submissions private until a final submission. So I think you can do it, Mina. Inky pinky swear, I really believe it.
All right, I think that we will move on to Tom Volterro. If we could elevate Tom Volterro. In the meantime, while we're doing that, we will be reviewing all of the comments and certainly some of the questions we will not be able to get to now, but we will answer all those questions in writing. So if we don't get them to tonight, those questions will be put into a document. So if they're not answered tonight, they will be answered eventually. Tom, why don't you go right ahead?
Great. First of all, can you hear me okay?
Yes, please.
All right. Good evening. And hello, Mike Betancourt. Nice to see you again.
Hey, Tom, how are you?
Mike and I were colleagues at our former jobs at American Tower. Thank you very much. So I reside at 24 Chester Street. For those of you who aren't familiar with the neighborhood, Chester Street is the street directly north of this development to the left. And I am a real estate attorney. And several of my neighbors were not able to make this meeting, but I will say that I speak for many of them who could not join. So I reviewed the RFP, and I guess I do have some questions and comments, but I mean, big picture, I understand and appreciate what the town has done to acquire this parcel and to avoid massive 40B developments. At the same time, I see a parcel that, if you consider the minimum lot requirements for a development, you could fit 8 houses there. So now we're thinking about putting 30 to 50 units there, which would be a substantial increase to the neighborhood. And considering this is an extremely busy intersection, Washington Street and Swanton Street are some of the busiest intersections in the town. I think there's a lot to consider just beyond how many units this lot can fit. Specifically, I think the number of units is a lot. And if the feasibility studies, if it's just those 3 documents that were posted in the RFP, did those feasibility studies take into account other factors like the traffic and the neighbor, the lack of on-street parking on Swanton Street and other considerations, or is it just an exercise to measure how big the lot was and how many things we can fit on there? I guess that's my first question. How did these feasibility studies get done? And is what is in the RFP the only, is that it, or is there more detail to it?
Thanks for the question, Tom. I don't know if a select board member or I could also, okay, Mike, why don't you answer the question of essentially how was the feasibility study done? What did it take into account in terms of parking ratios and other factors?
Thanks, Brian. So I can't fully answer the question, but we did do 3 different feasibility studies, and we can certainly provide those to you, Tom. I think they are public documents, but we can get them to you. And we did look at the highest and best use for the property for affordable housing and for commercial use as well, right? When we're trying to, because right now it's zoned for commercial use. The authority that we have from town meeting restricts the use to affordable housing. So that's what we can do there. And we took the property under the eminent domain authority. So that limits the purpose of what we can do there based on the authority issued. So we are limited to affordable housing. We did do, the studies looked at the property carrying enough parking to service the building. And so that's, so the different designs that we looked at really took that into account. So the neighborhood really asked us and encouraged us to have retail space there as well. And so that's something that, we wanted to include as part of the plan. Obviously, it impacts the viability financially of the project to do that, because really the affordability of the building, can limits what the revenue can be generated from the parcel is. So I think we're definitely focused on the affordability of the project, and that's what town meeting gave us authority to put out an RFP. But we did, when we were evaluating this before we were taking it, before we went to town meeting, we did look at commercial use, but we would not be able to use that authority to really put any sort of single family homes there at this point. So that would be not desirable and not really what our policy objective was either. So
understood. Now, I understand that you're trying to get to the magic number of 40, to meet the overarching goals. But again, as an abutter, and someone who will be watching this very closely and as necessary appealing it, I'm obviously concerned about the impact to the neighborhood. As it is, So I've lived here for 40 years. I've seen the bustle when it was really busy in the 80s, and I've seen, how what it's turned into today. But there's never enough parking. And let's be frank, every parking space is less revenue to a developer and to the town. But you're putting one space per unit, which again, if this is a mixed development, I believe the zoning bylaws require 2 spaces. If there's a combined business and residential component. But the end result is people are going to be parking on Chester Street. Because none of these plans, they ever consider, what if someone has a guest or has a party, or there's snow, or what if these businesses do really well? And we've seen parking on Chester Street when Franny's was around, lined up and down the street. So we're even seeing people from Swanton Street park on our street because their driveways are too, they can only fit one car. So, the end of the day is this thing will be built and we're going to have a parking problem on Chester Street, and everybody at this fine meeting is going to be long gone. And we'll be left to having to call the Winchester police or to have to get resident stickers. So, I think we should take a second look at this one parking space per unit and consider other factors as well. Because again, you're having up to 150 people on this lot and a lot more cars. And despite the fact that you may have one per unit, people may have a second car that they just park on a side street. Because again, in the summertime, there's no overnight parking restrictions. So again, I don't want to have to police my street every day and then pat the town on the back they've met their affordable housing requirements.
Just to follow up, Tom, we do invariably with these projects do a traffic and parking study that goes along with it. So that's, part of what we do because we want to see that impact. And if we do need to restrict parking in certain neighborhoods that we feel are going to be, like Chester Street, where people are going to park, we can make those decisions as well. So, but it's a good question, right? This is a new use for that location, and it's been dormant for a decade essentially. So even if we manage it all properly, it's going to feel like a lot of traffic coming in. So certainly appreciate the feedback.
Thanks for that. So Stephen Boksansky was actually in line, but had to drop. But this question I think is for Jen Goldson, and then I'm still going to go right on down the line. Roger Wilson, Sarah Swartz, Stephanie Zaremba, and then Dorothy Simboli. But the question for you, Jen, was that it was curious to how the weighting is determined for the various factors. Is there a standard formula for these? And thanks and Happy New Year. So if you could talk a little bit about evaluation criteria and how generally you've seen in other.
Yeah, so when we worked last year with the working group and went through the different, criteria that they wanted to include, we went through a process and discussions with them around what are the priorities and came up with the weighting system based on what the working group, talked to us about as priorities. So it's, something there's nothing standard about it. It's completely customized based on what the town wants to weight higher and lower.
Thanks. Sarah Swartz, if we could elevate Sarah to a panelist.
Roger is here first. I already brought him in while Jen was talking.
Wonderful, even better. Sorry about that. Roger, didn't mean to skip over you. That. Go right ahead, Roger, with your question or comment.
I would make a comment, which is that I would strongly recommend that there be no criteria that weights the importance of, I guess it was deeply affordable or something of that nature. I think the purpose of our housing plan is strictly and exclusively to meet the requirements of the state. If we did not have state requirements for affordable housing, we wouldn't be doing this. We wouldn't have a housing plan And we need to focus on meeting the requirements of the state at the minimum cost to the town as quickly as we can. And we have many more of these units to build. So this is just one. And I believe in town meeting, Brian answered a question I posed about how many more of this scale we need to have. We need to have something on the order of 12 of these things. We need to be able to locate them all over town, and we need to be able to do it in a way that attracts, as John Miller was talking about, as many bidders as possible. So we need it very simple. And I don't think that the making things, trying to solve a regional problem for affordability by Winchester's acting alone makes any sense whatsoever. This is a state problem. The state imposed this standard on us, and we should meet the state's requirements unless we can get them overturned. And there's been no stomach for changing 40B beyond what has been changed. So we got to meet it. And that's what I think we should do. My questions are, one, whether there's any contemplation of leasing this land to the developer rather than selling it. And secondly, who is the administrator of these or manager of these buildings? Is that the developer or somebody that they sell it to, or is the town involved in any way? Because I thought the first questioner's comments were very pertinent as far as you know, the add-ons and so forth, just how a supposedly affordable unit is administered.
Sure. So maybe this is a question for select board or potentially legal counsel in terms of how this deal could be developed, of whether or not that one, two questions here. One, whether or not it could be a lease, and then lease the land. And then on top of that, is that who would actually be managing it, and what type of you know, other types of development agreements would govern really, I believe that's what you were trying to get at, Roger.
Yeah.
So why don't we, is there a select board member, Susan? Why don't you go right ahead?
Sure. Since the town is buying this land, we wanted to recoup as much of the purchase price as we could by selling it. That was the plan so far. And then the second question about who would be managing is, I'm not sure what the draft RFP says right now, but I think typically we would want to know that the developer, you know, proposing to redevelop this would have had, you know, some experience running and building some, you know, similar affordable projects, including managing them or having a management company that they typically use. And we want to know more about that to ensure that it's well managed, because, you know, not only the things that that were already mentioned about, you know, add-ons and making rents go up, you want to be sure that the building is maintained well too. So that would be part of our the RFP process.
Roger, a follow-up, unless we'll go on to the next.
Well, I was the one that asked about the construction costs, and I just I just wanted to make a comment that I don't believe that our construction costs, that Winchester's construction costs are abnormal. What's abnormal in Winchester is our land value, so I believe that a good deal of the condo cost in Winchester is a function of the land value, underneath it, so not the construction per se.
Michael Betancourt, you had your hand up, and then after that, when we get Sarah Swartz elevated to a panelist, and Mike, I want you to
Thank
go
you,
right ahead.
Uh, yeah, thanks, Brian. I
Sorry.
really just wanted to follow up on the previous question from Mr. Wilson, but I think that, you know, we are kind of expanding our understanding of this parcel through this RFP discussion. I think we might consider a developer that wants us to hold on to the land and maybe pays us over time to recover our initial investment. So if that gives us the right flexibility over a period of time, and it might be the best solution. So, you know, to Dr. Miller's point, I think we want to create as much competition and much flexibility as possible through the RFP process. And that creativity, I think, is going to really allow for the best project for us. So I don't think that we would, where initially we were very focused on recovering the purchase price immediately. It may be that there's a creative financing option that the town would engage in. So we need to structure the RFP to allow for that. So if possible, so we're definitely listening. So thank you.
Thanks, Mike. I believe the next Sarah Swartz. I'm not sure what happened to her. She was put
She
over
was
as a
here and
panelist.
then
Bill
showed up, so I don't
Nemza.
know what happened.
Little Houdini.
Yes. Well done. Do you want me to bring in Stephanie?
Yeah, I think we're gonna have to. Sorry, Sarah, you'll be next, but Stephanie Zaremba.
All right, hold on.
You have 5 minutes with a minute follow-up after that.
Okay, Stephanie's in.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. This is Stephanie Zaremba. I live on Park Ave at the corner of Park and Highland, which, again, similar to a previous speaker, if you don't know, is just one block up. Swanton Street turns into Park, so I'm right up the road from this. And just wanted to share a couple of things. You know, in general, I think people who are happy with what's happening don't tend to speak up to say, this is good. So in general, I just want to speak up to say, I think we're on the right path here, and I'm pleased with the progress and the draft of the RFP and some of the inputs that are going to be taken from tonight. I do share the concerns of one of the previous speakers about traffic and parking. It's definitely already an issue on some of these nearby and side streets. People will definitely park on my street too. So I hear that. I think to Mr. Betancourt's point, there are other ways of mitigating that aren't impacting the specifics of this development. There are a lot of other things that we can do through traffic planning and other restrictions and get this to work, though obviously we want to provide as much on-site parking for the residents here as we can. Ultimately, though, we have to come back to the fact that we have an obligation regarding affordable housing. It is not just an obligation per the state law. It's not I don't agree that it's a state problem. It's a moral obligation, particularly of a town as generally well off as ours, to not become a de facto gated community where we can't have socioeconomic diversity. And Winchester is really, there's no two ways about it. Like, we have failed over the past many years. We are not fulfilling that obligation. Like I said, I think it's really great that we are taking so much input. I really respect Mr. Miller's points, and I think it's great to have them raised now. I just want to caution that ultimately, I'm also a lawyer in town, but I don't work for the town. And so ultimately, where our elected and appointed and employed officials have made decisions about the experts we're going to retain and consultants and lawyers, I want to make sure that we are careful that we're ultimately letting them be giving us legal advice. You can't really crowdsource legal advice to a certain degree. It kind of sets a dangerous precedent. I think we're, like I said, on the right path here. We really have to create more affordable housing. I asked a question in writing earlier I'd love to hear some commentary on balancing the financial returns to the town with our need to create affordable housing. I don't think it's just a matter of hitting that 25%, so it all counts towards the stock. I really would love to hear some of the members of our town government talk about how we're going to provide actual affordable housing, not numbers on paper that count. So thank you.
Thank you. So Susan, Rich, or Mike, members of town government. The question is really, how is the price going to that we paid for the property going to weigh out in the end for the affordable housing goals that we have for the site?
Well, the first thing that I would say would to sort of pick up on what Ms. Zaremba said is that we have to also remember that this is not a problem that, you know, we are living in Winchester now necessarily caused. It's a legacy of a lot of things, including the whole period of time in the 30s and 40s and 50s when the federal government was subsidizing homeownership, but distributing that subsidy according to a set of maps that directed investment away from communities of color and towards actually with the aim of and the result of segregating our neighborhoods. And the town has had, I'm not sure quite how long 40B has been in effect, but the town has had some 30 or 40 years to add affordable housing, had opportunities at some point, I think in the 80s with when school enrollments were declining, there were some schools being accessed. Those could have been converted to affordable housing. I can remember while I was living here, there was a big discussion about the pansy patch being affordable, and it turned into something else. So we're trying to do the best we can, and I know it's hard to accept the fact that this is the obligation of, it's a statewide problem because statewide these units have not been being created over the years. And in terms of the sales price, this is something I'm trying to wrap my mind around as well, because when you take property by eminent domain, the eminent domain laws require you to pay fair market value based on the highest and best use, which is defined as the most profitable use, the use that would bring in the most revenue. And when you're building affordable housing, what you can charge for rents is restricted. So we're kind of got our feet on two different pieces of ice, and we've got to figure out a way to build this in a way that will recoup as much of the sales price as we can. But I think it's possible that we would also consider investing in leaving some money in the project so that we can build it and have a well-built, well-designed, and not outsized building at the end of the day. The only other thing that I would add is that this is something that, you know, part of the reason why the RFP is so complicated and has so many holes in it. We need to work on that very quickly. I don't know if anybody would add anything else.
Mike or Rich? If no, yep, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that, you know, again, it's going to be a balancing of interests. If there's an opportunity for the town to make a decision about getting more affordable units, you know, I think that will be attractive to us. So with 40B, you know, there is a perception of affordable units that are being created. You're getting credit for you know, X amount of units, 100% of rentals, but you're really only building 25% of those units for people. So, you know, I think that we want to engage in that conversation with the developer. If we want units that are set aside that are disability units, if they're, you know, so it's going to be a dialogue with developers, which, you know, we've been very experienced at it recent years. And so I think that's what we really want to send the message of, the SHI is certainly a priority for us, recovery of prices, but there's some flexibility and creativity there that I think can meet our goals that are not just around 40B and getting to 10%. They're, as Stephanie had mentioned, they're moral goals that the town has committed to. So that's just something to add. So thank you.
Stephanie, would you like a follow-up, or if not, we will continue on.
No, that was really great and helpful. Thank you.
Right, so it is a Houdini moment. Sarah Swartz is actually Bill Nemser. So Bill Nemser, why don't you go right ahead and you can unmute yourself, and the floor is yours for 5.
Sorry, I pirated my wife's laptop. Bill Nemser, 43 Irving Street. I have a question, actually 2 questions about the, we've talked about 40B and really going beyond 40B. I'm curious if there have been discussions that have gone on regarding off-site improvements or potential mitigation for the effects that many of the abutters, residents, so on, have expressed in this particular proposal. And then the second part, and I don't know, I really don't know if there's anything that's happened with this. Is there potential, or is there a development agreement that's separate of what the town requires in their RFP? And if so, are there points available for that? Thank you.
Sure. So I think Jen, I think that might make sense, at least. It is. I think it might make sense for you to answer the question about one is one of the evaluation criteria anything to do with some type of conditions related to a development agreement. Any development agreement, just for your knowledge, would have to be approved by town meeting. And it would be outside of the RFP. But Jen, if you wanted to handle that question, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, I was just looking through the criteria, but in terms of the development agreement, I guess I'm not sure of what the exact question was. I was looking back at the criteria to look at the traffic mitigation, because I thought he said something about off-site mitigation, if we would rank that more highly. Yeah.
Sure, of course. If in the event that the RFP considered off-site mitigation of some sort, the neighborhoods, we've heard about parking in the neighborhoods, we've heard about traffic and so on. And I totally understand that. I'm in a neighborhood. But nonetheless, I was curious if mitigation was considered as part of the RFP proposal, and if not, could it be accomplished by creating a development agreement with the developer?
I see. Yeah, so it is currently criteria number 6 is as highly advantageous. The developer would provide an analysis of the changes in traffic circulation and volume associated with the site and demonstrates commitment to mitigation measures, including improvements to bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, is the way it reads right now.
Yeah.
So that may not be exactly what you were looking for in terms of other traffic mitigation measures.
Oh, well, just that it wasn't off-site.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's a little vague. It doesn't specifically say off-site. It just says demonstrate commitment to mitigation measures, including improvements to bicycle and pedestrian. So we could rework that. Yeah.
I think demonstrating a community benefit would be very advantageous to this proposal. I generally don't get involved in this stuff because I
you do it all day long.
Yes, but that would be my question for Brian and for Jen. Perhaps that would be a way to inch this forward. But thank you both for your efforts, and thank you, Michael, for all you've done. appreciate all the dialogue tonight. And with that, I'll sign off. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bill. We will, well, okay, so next, if we could elevate Dorothy Simboli and then Enzo Rascianato, and then if no one else wants to speak, John Miller, but generally we would let anyone who would wish to speak first, and then if no one else would like, we certainly will take anybody else who would like to speak again. It's 8:23 and there's plenty of time currently. So Dorothy Simboli, whenever you're ready, why don't you introduce yourself and go right ahead?
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for taking the time to host this presentation this evening. I live at 17 Bigelow Avenue. First off, there's so much that's been said, and I just want to try to address everything and then give you guys a couple of questions. I agree with Select Board Member Verdicchio that Winchester has historically fell way behind in developing affordable housing in Winchester, and that has left us in quite a predicament. My concern in that equation is that we need to acknowledge that that will come at a cost to the middle income and senior members of our residential community. Winchester is woefully deficient in commercial real estate taxpayers. So to the extent that this project could include some sort of retail commercial tenants, I think Winchester needs that. I mean, any place where you can get some commercial real estate, we need to do it. And I'm going to ask another question later on that's sort of going to address that issue. But I just want to say in trying to create an economically diverse community, which I think we all want to have happen in Winchester, we really need to protect our middle income and our senior members. So I have two questions, and I apologize if one of these was already answered. And I ask this only because I have a lot of feedback from other members of the community who are really confused on this. What is the legal status of this taking, of the eminent domain taking? And is there any possibility that this is going to be challenged by the prior owner? And where does that, like, what's the status of it? And what's the likelihood that the eminent domain taking is in place and we're all set with that? And then the second question is specifically for Select Board Member Betancourt. And this is to clarify his answer with regard to the possibility of retail being put into this development. Could town meeting retroactively approve a mixed-use development, and specifically without compromising the legality of the taking? And that might be more for Mina to answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy. I think that the first question is, what is the legal status of the taking and where we at and where we are with how free and clear we are with the property. I would say, Mina, that would be, why don't you go right ahead with that? And then I think the second question is also yours as well. And then others would chime in. So what's the legal status of the takings at the moment?
Sure. The taking is legally complete. The town owns the property. Damages, which is a term for the payment for the property, were already paid. So that is, it owns it free and clear of title. The former owner has 3 years to challenge the amount of the taking. And so that's out there, but that doesn't change the effectiveness of the taking itself. The town owns the property. The second question regarding commercial use, town meeting town meeting will have to eventually authorize the sale. That was where things are left. or other use of it. And to the extent that commercial use is limited to a smaller amount that's customary in a mixed use development with affordable housing, because that does happen for affordable housing developments across the state, it would be consistent with the use. That's something we thought about before the taking happened. And so that's an option that would still be on the table. So the RFP could include that. That's a policy choice for the town.
Dorothy, a follow-up?
No, I mean, I'd love to hear back from Select Board Member Bettencourt on that if he wants to give us some input. Only because he was commenting that we were fairly limited in terms of including the retail. So just wanted to hear some follow-up from him.
All right, Mike, go right ahead on the clarity of that of what you meant.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Dorothy, for the question. What we've understood from evaluating the property is, and what we understand at a greater level, looking at the market now, is that mixed use, it comes with a, it's a struggle financially for developers where the economics of that really favor housing units in Winchester. So that's where the money is. So I think that we always discussed having a coffee shop or limited retail there that's kind of really respectful of the neighborhood's interest, of the history of the property, and really what kind of can activate that area. So, but that doesn't mean that we can really shift more broadly to expanding a large footprint of retail there. The market doesn't necessarily drive that when we're looking at affordable housing units. So, I think we'll see what developers come up with, but what we've understood from our appraisals and from speaking with other developers is that mixed use idea in certain properties isn't ideal for recovering revenue. So that's so we'll see. It's definitely something that we prioritize, but there's going to have to be a real balance there for the property when there's that much affordability that's required.
Thanks for that, Mike. We're going to now elevate Enzo Rascinato to a panelist. And then after that, it would be Jean Chastain. And then there are a couple of questions in the chat that we might be able to answer very quickly before we go back to Tom Volterra, who has spoken already. Again, we're trying to get all unique members first, and then to recycle anyone else who would want to get back into the queue. Enzo Rascinato. Yep, go right ahead.
Brian, can I share my screen?
Patty, I believe you can. As a panelist now, you should be able to do that.
Yeah, I did make him a panelist.
Yep. All right, go right ahead. Yep, we can see.
You
we
see
can
that?
see the screen. Yep, go right ahead.
So I think my question was really around the criteria and the weightings, right? And I just wanted to make sure, I mean, obviously the weightings are going to be extremely important in terms of what proposal gets selected. And, from what I've heard, I mean, it seems like purchase price is really critical to the overall, importance of the overall criteria. But when we look at how the weightings are currently put in there, it's weighted as the highest weighting. This is 4x, but it's really only 4/30ths or 2/15ths of the overall criteria, because we have so many other criteria, right? So I laid this out, for me, it's not necessarily, I think it's up to the select board ultimately to decide what the right criteria mix is. But, I just tried to lay out a couple of examples of potential proposals and how those would measure up against the criteria that we've laid out, right? So if you look here, you've got 3 proposals, let's say, that are mostly exactly the same, except for just looking at purchase price. You have a $3 million proposal, a $5.2 or $5.3 million proposal, and then an extreme example of a $1 proposal. And one's 40%, 25%, 50%. And then the only other difference is really, I'm picking on the climate change criteria, but it could be any of the other smaller criteria. If you just flip, if one of those, if that $1 proposal has just a little bit of an advantage on those smaller criteria, it could actually be more valuable, at least based on the way the criteria is written, than the $5.2 million proposal with a 25% affordable housing, right? So, you know, I lay that out not because you know, I have a favorable, you know, a favorite around amongst the various criteria. Just saying, like, I think as we go through, I think we should consider the wording of that criteria, especially the one around purchase price and affordable housing, because it can very easily move the needle in terms of what proposal we would have to pick. And I think by playing with those weightings, I think we can consider better what a winning proposal we want a winning proposal to look like in the end, right? And that might be less criteria. It might be maybe even different weightings. So, like, you know, if you go to the Excel version of this, right, and you know, if you just weighted purchase price like higher, let's say you weighted purchase price at 15, then suddenly, you know, that middle proposal, which I think a lot of people would say is the best of these three three extreme examples that I put out here, tops out. So just by changing the weightings, we don't have to go on a 1, 2, 3, 4 scale. We can mess with those based on what the town desires as most important. Still have all the criteria, but maybe just changing the mix or the weights associated with those. So I don't know if there's a question in there. It was more of a statement, but I guess maybe Ms. Goldson's some discussion around, did you consider that in terms of the weightings themselves and you know, what that thought process was?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. When we worked on the RFP over a year ago, we didn't include purchase price as one of the considerations. So that was added more recently. And we also didn't have the criteria that he needed to be 100% of the units on the SHI. So it was sort of a different animal back when it was first written. So I think there are some considerations around the weighting. And I think that's been raised as well by other boards and commissions around what are our priorities here and how do these weighting systems really shake out with different scenarios.
Thanks for that. And Enzo, did you have a follow-up? But I think that the point was that there's some honing in and some refining of the evaluation criteria to produce the result that is most importantly reflects the town meeting vote, and then also is actually desirable by the majority of the town.
Yeah, exactly. I think that would be my follow-up. I think, Brian, you followed up better than I would be able to, right? In terms of just like looking at some of those potential, what you think a winning proposal would look like, and then seeing how it measures up against the criteria and the math that we've laid out in the RFP, and making sure that those two things align.
Thanks, Enzo. Jean, why don't you go right ahead? You got 5 minutes.
Great, thanks so much. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very informative. First and foremost, I'd like to say I'm relieved that the town has purchased the parcel and is moving ahead with a residential project. I live at 266 Washington Street, which is 2 houses away on the corner of Washington and Oak Street. So we've been living with what's been there for a very long time. So I'm very relieved about that. But I guess I would say, to me, putting a residential project here is activating the neighborhood. In the chat, I did raise a concern about retail. So first and foremost, parking is a problem in the entire area, as there are other high density units and multifamily units, and there's just not a lot of parking. And the high school, although I think maybe that's been more resolved. So parking is a big concern for me, not only for the folks that will be living in the units, but whatever retail or commercial units may go in there. And I guess when I think of retail, I think the whole reason that there was such an opposition to CVS is really the quick in and out of cars that would be circulating through there. And while the traffic itself on Washington Street may not be at a higher volume, the fact that cars are just turning in and out makes it very difficult to get on and off the street. So it takes me forever to get out of my driveway onto Washington Street. And if I'm making a left, forget it. You know, I might as well just make a right and go around the block. It's really terrible. And that's even during the pandemic. So I guess I would say if there is an option to go more toward commercial space that would have less frequency of traffic, whether it's an insurance agency or something where people are going in, maybe it's more the people that work there versus customers that are coming in and out. I think that's a really important consideration. You know, that was a huge concern with the CVS. I think even a coffee shop, you can, you know, go downtown Winchester and cars are parked in every no parking zone just to get in and out of Starbucks. It makes me crazy. But I could see that the same thing happening here. People will just block other people's driveways or what have you. So I did want to raise the concern on the traffic coming in and out, in addition to the folks that will be living there and would need their 1 or 2 parking spaces. Those are my greatest concerns that I wanted to express today. But thank you, and I hope things go ahead smoothly. Thanks.
Thank you, Jean. It does seem to be a theme with the concerns related to traffic and mitigation related to that. Krista Russo, and then Tom Voltero, and then we'll get into a few quick things in the chat just to try to, if we have time. So Krista Russo, why don't you, whenever you're ready, why don't you go right ahead?
Hi, everyone. And I joined Stephanie and Jean by saying thank you so much for the taking of this property, for going forward, for putting so much thought into this whole project. For full disclosure, my family owns the adjacent lot, about 50,000 square feet adjacent to this property. We also live in the neighborhood, so we have a lot invested in the area. What I think is important for maybe someone on the select board to mention is how this project changed at town meeting when the amendment was introduced and approved. So I had been part of the working group and working with Jen and Mike, and you know, we started with this RFP, but something did change at town meeting. And I think financially, it's really important to point out how that amendment may change the desirability of a developer to partner with us in this project. Thank you.
Sure. So the question is about really what happened at town meeting most recently. There were 2 votes, and I'm thinking I might be quickest if I just go right in and answer that. The 2 votes that were held at town meeting, one was that price had to be part of the criteria. And then the second vote was that all of the units had to count on the SHI. Jen Goldson did go over that very quickly in evaluation criteria, but those were the 2 votes that affected the RFP in terms of why price is now an evaluation criteria, and why a minimum threshold requirement of the RFP currently is that all of the units must count on the SHI. There are 2 ways that that can happen, and Jen can go into a little bit further if there's a follow-up, Krista, but there are 2 ways that all the units can count. Is it 25% at 80% of AMI, and 20% or 20% of the units at 50% of AMI? So Krista, did you have a follow-up question?
No, I think that, you know, it's just important that if people don't understand the 40B law, that they really read about it, because we don't have 10% affordable housing, we are, as Dorothy said, in a terrible predicament. And we really don't have the luxury to sell this lot for the highest price for luxury condos and maybe double our money. And there is the social justice aspect of it, which I think is really important. So I just ask people to understand the 40B law, understand that the state doesn't really care what the impact is on our schools. And if I'm incorrect, please let me know. The state doesn't really care about parking and traffic. And I think the town will do everything they can to mitigate those aspects. but we're in a rough spot right now. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Krista. So if no one else has their hand raised other than Tom Volterro, I guess we would elevate Tom Volterro again. And while we're doing that, Krista, to answer your state, very kind of quick comment / question about the state. It's not that the state maybe necessarily wouldn't care about traffic or schools. It's that they're viewing just that Massachusetts is in a housing crisis right now. So they're just extremely focused on creating housing.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Tom Volterro.
Sure, I'll be very brief.
Yes.
And I guess I want to, I appreciate Mike Bettencourt's comments about the struggles of proposing, retail to a developer. Again, having lived in Winchester for 4 years, I've seen a lot of businesses go out of business. I mean, even like look at 14 Thompson Street, how many restaurants have been there and turned over. So I would strongly advise the board to, I guess, to reconsider the emphasis on the retail component of this, because if you think about it, if retail does really, really well there, then now you're creating a major parking issue because you have lots of customers. But if it does poorly, then the developer is really going to take a financial hit. So, as many of you know, in the summertime, I mean, Winchester's a ghost town. And this neighborhood isn't really, you don't get any foot traffic. There's no kids walking home from school. And if we do have successful retail here, what does that mean to the downtown businesses that are closing right now? So I just want to put that out there as something to consider, and maybe to just do this as a purely residential development and cut out the retail to simplify it.
Okay, thanks, Tom. It doesn't look like a question there. Very quickly, I guess, a couple of questions in the chat that were related to previous speakers that could be answered very quickly. What is this? Is hazardous waste at all mentioned in the RFP? The answer is no. And that typically, should we be mentioning about the possibility of hazardous waste? I want to let Jen go first, and then maybe Mina, in terms of what you've seen previously. Not that you, Jen, have any knowledge about whether or not there is hazardous waste. It's still unclear of the dry cleaner actually performed that was previously there, whether it performed it on site or sent it off. But more of what you've seen in other communities, and then we'll get something from.
Yeah, I mean, typically, if there's a phase 1 environmental report that has been done, we would, talk about the findings and then include that as an exhibit. But other than that, we typically, it's part of the developer's due diligence. I don't know if Mina wants to add to that at all.
Thank you, Jen.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. Two things. One, that's exactly right. There is my understanding is the town is working on having a phase 1 completed right now, and that would be made available as part of it. And then to come back to something I mentioned earlier, there's also an interest in potentially putting together at least the form of the land development agreement template, and that would also address the environmental risks and who's going to take them on in there, so that potential bidders know to do their due diligence on environmental issues.
Thanks for that, Mina. I see Mike has his hand up. So just a very quick moment time. So it's I have 8:46. We had allotted till about 9 o'clock for this. But like I said, any of the questions that are in the chat or the Q&A, we will eventually answer well, as quickly as we can, but they will be answered. Mike, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I'll just quickly kind of clarify the difference between phase 1 and phase 2 studies as far as my limited understanding. Phase 1 is kind of an evaluation of kind of the existing records that are out there on the property to see if there's been past exposure, if it's been remediated, if there are other kind of red flags that we should be aware of. And then phase 2 is a little bit more, in depth, where there would be testing, and certainly Jen or me or Brian can correct me on this. So so I think that we've done an initial analysis, and but what we've heard from developers is that unless there's a known substantial risk, they kind of see this as business as usual in Massachusetts, and they aren't scared off by that. They realize it's kind of a cost of doing business. So we are, when we move forward with the project to town meeting, we did a pretty intense analysis, more on the phase 1 side. So, but we're going to continue to do that as we move forward. But it's going to be really, that burden will be shifted off to the developer.
Oh, sorry about that. Another, I think, pertinent question, just going through the chat here, there are a lot of comments that aren't necessarily questions, but is there a timeline requirement for the development? So I think that's probably Mina, if you would want to weigh in there, if whether or not there's a timeline for the requirement based upon anything that we've done in terms of acquiring the property.
Nothing you've done to date ties you to a particular timeline. It is typical, and Jen can correct me if I'm wrong on this, it's typical to ask for a timeline, and that is something you often set some expectations for, and you also get a proposal for with the responses.
Thanks for that. I'll just keep kind of going through. There's a lot of very specific questions related to the square footage of a specific unit. How big will these units be? And it's definitely it's premature. There are some questions about possibly resurveying the neighborhood, as in the last time that the Melanson proposal was before the town. It's been several years, and new people have moved in. So there's some questions about whether or not the select board would potentially survey the neighborhood in general. There have been about 3 or 4 questions about unrelated, that where people were not either living in town or were not informed about those meetings. I think unless anyone's gonna have your hand up, I think I think we might just take the rest of these questions and answer them as quickly as we can. But if so, I'm not really seeing anybody with their hand up. Susan, if you wanted to kind of talk briefly about next steps in terms of where the potential outcomes we have moving forward.
Right. Well, the first thing that I would mention is that if anybody has any further questions, something occurs to you tomorrow, you can still send in written questions and comments to the town manager's office at winchester.us. And as far as a timeline, certainly the select board is very conscious that there are carrying costs for this property, and we don't want things to stretch out too much. We want to keep moving, and certainly we need to regroup as a board and digest all of these comments and suggestions, and try to there's some decisions to be made, and try to wrestle with the criteria and the process that we're going to use, and work with Jen and with staff to finalize this and get it out there, because we want to understand if there's interest and what the challenges are, and we certainly want to move forward with the redevelopment of the land. So those are the next steps. I think we may have set a very aggressive schedule so far, and that's something else we have to talk about as a board and make some decisions. So thanks for it. Thank you to everybody for coming, and thank you to Jen and Mina and to acting town manager and to our town planner. Thank you all.